Well, welcome, and how wonderfully exciting it is, as everyone just expressed, to have Senator McCain with us on this very, very important occasion. The way we're gonna do this is we're gonna have two brief introductory statements, and I just want to say a word about the two people who are gonna make brief introductory statements. One is Senator John McCain, and the other is the producer of this film that we're gonna see, Vladimir Kara-Murza. Last week, in this same room, we had a memorial symposium honoring Liu Xiaobo, the Chinese dissident and Nobel laureate who died in prison on July the 10th, who was a great man. And at that symposium, we called him a hero of truth, a hero of truth. I don't think that there are two people in the world today to whom that title applies more appropriately than Senator John McCain and Vladimir Kara-Murza, two people who are really at the forefront of defending the idea of freedom in the world today. And it's just a tremendous honor to have both of them with us today. So it's with great pride and honor that I invite Senator John McCain to come up here and to say some words to us.
All right, says turn off equipment when you're done. Is that my pacemaker or? Thank you, Carl. Thank you for your kind words. And my dear friends, it's an honor to be here tonight with Vladimir Kara-Murza for the screening of his remarkable documentary, Nemtsov. Vladimir, you have truly honored the example of your friend and comrade, and your efforts to advance freedom and justice in Russia are a testament to your strength of character and love of your country. Boris Nemtsov was not my only friend, but also a personal hero. He was one of Russia's earliest and most passionate economic and political reformers, and he never stopped believing that Russia could transform from a communist dictatorship to a thriving democracy. As you know, after serving in multiple government positions, he ultimately came to lead Russia's beleaguered opposition and served as a powerful advocate for the rights and freedom of Russia's citizens throughout the world. Even after countless arrests and threats on his life, Boris never stopped fighting for democracy, human rights, and rule of law in Russia. I often think about the last meeting we had in my office. I warned him that Putin was incapable of tolerating what he stood for, a society in which ideals and morality stand as the foundation of law and order, and that he would have him killed. I begged Boris to be careful, but he was as courageous as ever. He told me that he had to return to Russia and continue the fight for freedom, even if it cost his life. Sadly, it did, but Boris was not the first, nor will he be the last victim of Putin's brutal regime. Putin has been increasingly unwilling to tolerate any kind of opposition. He has ruthlessly murdered his political opponents in Russia and abroad. He harasses and intimidates civil society organizations. He has tried to suppress free and independent media. And that's to say nothing of the litany of human rights abuses he has committed beyond Russia's borders. All of this has created a culture of impunity in Russia that is expressly designed to permit and encourage attacks on freedom of expression, association, and assembly, the fundamental rights that Boris was fighting for. Ultimately, Boris came to symbolize a more democratic, more prosperous, and more vibrant Russia, a country that respected the rights of its citizens and was at peace with itself and its neighbors. True Russian patriots, inspired by Boris's example, know this Russia is worth the fighting for, and I hope Americans will stand in solidarity with those brave Russian patriots who long for greater opportunity, greater freedom, greater protection of their rights under the rule of law. My friends, we are now reaching crossroads in Russia. Over the summer, tens of thousands of citizens across the country participated in protests to demand accountability and end corruption. Putin responded predictably with violence, by attacking free speech and detaining hundreds of protesters and political activists. But the demand for freedom and dignity cannot be denied. If we learn anything from these demonstrations, let it be just this, that just like Boris, the American people will not be intimidated by the Putin regime. They will continue to fight against the culture of hate, fear, and violence that the Putin regime relies on to maintain power. It's an honor and a privilege to call Boris my friend. I'm happy to see his legacy immortalized in this documentary, and I know that his spirit and courage will continue to inspire all those in Russia and throughout the world who seek to live in freedom. Thank you.
The senator spoke about the courage of Boris Nemtsov, and he told him not to go back because Putin would kill him. They tried to kill Vladimir twice. In May of 2015, just 3 months after Boris Nemtsov was shot, killed, and then again in February of this year. And he continues to fight. He made this movie after the first attempt on his life, and he continues to fight. And even though I've told him not to, and other friends have told him not to, he's going to go back to continue the struggle. And he's an individual who is of enormous courage, just like Boris Nemtsov, and is somebody who can carry on that struggle. And he carries it on with hope and vision. And we'll talk about this later, but there is reason to be hopeful today. This is not a struggle that Putin is going to win, because the Russian people do not back him. Vladimir.
Carl, thank you so much. And you really know how to embarrass someone before coming on the stage. And I'll be very, very brief. I just want to say a few words, because everything I wanted to say will be in that film. I want to thank everyone who made this film possible and who made it possible to have our screening here tonight. But before I do that, I just want to say that this is a film that should not have been made, at least not for a long, long, long time. And I have no words to describe what I would give not to have had to make it. It took me about 1.5 years to make this documentary. The actual work took a year, but I've had to take a long break in the middle for the reasons Carl has alluded to. And this was working on this film was a very educational process for me, apart from anything else. I learned and discovered many new things in the process. I now know that it's almost impossible to make a film about a close friend who'd been murdered. This film was without doubt the most difficult thing I ever had to do in my life. And there were just so many times where I had to drag myself by the hair, just push myself and to force myself not to give up and stop and to carry on and to see this to completion. I also discovered a new level, or I should probably say a new depth, of human cowardice. It's when people, for fear or for political expediency, refuse to appear in a film, refuse to speak well of someone who is dead, just because he was an opponent of the current government. I'm not going to name any names, and I did not back in Russia either when we were showing this film back home. It is not for me to judge. But I also had an opportunity to appreciate something much, much more important, and that is that political views and human decency have nothing to do with each other. And in this film, you will see very different people. Not only those who are in opposition, like Boris Nemtsov was, like I am, but also some who are very much a part of the present system in Russia. And it was very important for me that those who could have been afraid chose not to be. I wanted this film to be a portrait of the man as he really was, as I knew him, as those of us around him knew him, without the slander, without the propaganda, without all the cliches, without all the lies that there were so many around him and about him, especially in recent years. And there are many things you will see in this film. There's just one thing you will not see in there, and that's death. There is no death. There's no bridge. I could not have done this any other way. And actually, many of the people that I interviewed when I was filming this documentary, when they were speaking about Boris Nemtsov, inadvertently switched into present tense. I want to thank everyone who made it possible for me to make this movie. Above all, I want to thank Boris Nemtsov's family for their help and advice and support, and for the invaluable archives which they gave me access to. I want to thank my team of producers, Rinat Davlet-Gildeev and Maria Lekuch. I could not have done this without them. I want to thank Open Russia and Mikhail Khodorkovsky for their support of this project, and the Institute of Modern Russia and Pavel Khodorkovsky for making it accessible to English-speaking audiences. And I should add that about 4 months ago, the Russian government designated both of those NGOs as foreign undesirable organizations that are prohibited to work on the territory of the Russian Federation. And I must say that apart from quite a few practical difficulties that this presents us with, we take this as a badge of honor coming from the current Russian regime. And above all, I want to thank my wife, Evgenia, whose patience, and that's another thing I learned while working on this documentary, apparently has no limits. I'm very grateful to our hosts here tonight, the National Endowment for Democracy, an organization that works tirelessly in support of freedom in the world, even in difficult conditions as they present themselves in many dictatorships, including Russia today. And I want to thank Carl Gershman for being our host tonight and for making this screening possible. And Senator McCain, I cannot even begin to express how honored and how grateful I am that you are here with us tonight, not only because of the tremendous respect that I know every person in this room, me included, has for you and for the work you have done over your lifetime, but also, and most importantly, because Boris Nemtsov always considered you a friend. And every time he would come here, and sometimes during those few months we were working to get the Magnitsky Act, to help the Magnitsky Act passed, it seemed like he was here every week. Every time he would come, however busy the schedule was, he always told me, make sure we see McCain. Make sure we have McCain on the schedule. And I can tell you that he always came out of those meetings in, I believe it was Senate Russell 241, invariably impressed with your insight and your interest and your involvement in the affairs in our part of the world, and for this we're very grateful. And I want to thank every one of you who is here tonight. We have shown this film now in more than 30 cities in Russia, in many places in Europe and North America. And every time and everywhere we show this film, many people come and show interest and take part in the discussions. And I know it's because of him. And Boris Nemtsov always had this one quality. Whether he was in government or in opposition, he would always bring people together. He always knew how to bring people together. And I can see that he continues to do this even now. And I know that we'll continue to do this for a very long time to come. So thank you very much. It's an honor and a pleasure to be with you today.
That was just a brilliant movie. Senator, you spoke, about Nemtsov before. What did you learn from that?
Price of freedom, the price of patriotism, and yet someday the people of Russia will honor his memory and appreciate the fact that he was part of a change in Russia that may take a long time, but he made a major contribution to. People will be talking in Russia and around the world about Boris for centuries to come.
I mean, he really was a very special kind of person. The idea that you have to be brave to be an opposition politician.
Yeah, as I mentioned to you, he was very well aware of the threats to his physical well-being. He was very aware that Vladimir Putin was capable of any act to prevent viable opposition to continue. And who was the leader of the most viable opposition? He was not naive, I believe, that he was very aware of the danger which he was placing himself, unfortunately, and his family.
Vladimir, you would talk yesterday about that Yaroslavl election in 2013 that he won. And now we're in this period, which is such a, in some ways, and you believe this, a hopeful period. I mean, You got to do it without him. But tell us a little bit about the kind of period that we're in now, what it means to do it without him.
Well, it's difficult to be hopeful and optimistic in the times we live in. You know, when your best friend is killed, when you almost die yourself twice in 2 years, it's not easy to remain an optimist, but I try to. And Boris had this phrase he'd always say to his friends, "Всё у нас получится." We'll always manage it in the end. And he used to write his books to people with this, and he always genuinely believed that he had absolutely no doubt in his mind throughout his whole life and political life that one day we'll get there. And he always believed fundamentally in his heart that Russia is no worse than any other country, and that our people deserve just as much as any other people to live under rule of law, with free elections, with media freedom, with human dignity. He certainly rejected this, this stereotype that's unfortunately so widespread for some reason, that somehow Russia and Russians are uniquely unsuited or not ready, or that they don't want freedom, they don't need freedom. He rejected this. He thought this is insulting. And he thought that fundamentally we're no better or no worse than any other nation that also lived under dictatorship. So many nations did and are now successful democracies, and he always believed in the bottom of his heart that this day will come, and it will. And when it does, his contribution to it will have been one of the greatest. And when I go around Russia and I meet these young people, young activists in the regions, young people who have spent their entire lives under Vladimir Putin, because let's not forget, this man has been in power for 18 years, same length of time as Leonid Brezhnev. And when I go and meet these young activists, I have to remind myself sometimes that I'm speaking to someone who has no other political memory in his or her life. All they have seen is his face on their television screens for all the time they've been alive on this earth. And it is that generation that's increasingly beginning to say, enough. We are fed up with this. We're fed up with the corruption, with the impunity for this corruption, with the aggression, with the disregard for the most basic rights and freedoms of a human being. And we saw those young people all across the country in the streets, as you mentioned, over the spring and again over the summer. Tens of thousands of people in about 200 towns and cities across the country, large and small, east to west, literally from Kaliningrad to Vladivostok, across 11 time zones of Russia. And they're coming out knowing that they will be met by riot police, that they will be met by the National Guard, a new separate military entity that was created by Putin 2 years ago with the express purpose of beating down opposition rallies. But they're still coming out. And they came once and then they came back again in June, and I know they will be back. Because I think we're beginning to reach this point with many of these young people, many of representatives of this young generation. It's not going to be an overnight process. It's going to take time. It's going to be a gradual thing. But I think we're beginning to reach this point when for many of these young people all across Russia, their self-awareness as citizens of their own country who want and demand respect from their own state is gradually becoming stronger than the sense of fear and then fear of potential repression. And I believe this is a turning point in so many ways, and I think it's a very worrying sign for the Kremlin. I certainly would be worried if I were them, but I think that is a very hopeful sign for Russia.
Could I just mention one thing? We talk about all the great things that Boris did in Russia. The fact is that I think one of the most important pieces of legislation that's passed was called the Magnitsky Act. And after Sergei Magnitsky was beaten and starved to death, there began a movement to punish the Russians for that. And that movement gathered strength, and at the right times, Boris came to Washington and met with us in the leadership and around the Senate and the House, and he was the catalyst that really changed it from one of many pieces of legislation to one that everybody acknowledges probably Vladimir Putin hates the worst. And so not only did Boris have an incredible effect in his own country, but with the members of the House and the Senate, the respect and the regard we had for him made possible probably one of the most painful blows to the oligarchs that are running Russia today. In fact, my dear friends, we had a sanctions list of Russians who were particularly corrupt and were involved in the Magnitsky's murder. So in retaliation, Vladimir Putin published a sanctions list, and I'm very happy to tell you that I've been sanctioned by Vladimir Putin I'm sure it's very upsetting to Cindy that we can't go to Siberia for spring break, but that sanctions list, that really had an effect. There's one thing that these oligarchs love to do, and that's travel around and spend a lot of money, and it hurt them. It hurt them badly, and so of all the actions that we've taken vis-a-vis the Russian, I would argue that the Magnitsky Act is best known in America and throughout the world. Wouldn't you agree?
I think it's the most important piece of human rights legislation that has been adopted at least in the last generation, and maybe more.
And I'm sure you would agree that this man was one of the factors in convincing the Congress and the American people to pass that legislation.
And now it's global, a global Magnitsky.
There's a global Magnitsky, and there's a movement in the Congress to strengthen Magnitsky in light of the Russians' attempt to change the outcome of our elections.
And I remember the day the Magnitsky Act was being passed in the House of Representatives. It was November the 16th, 2012, the third anniversary of the killing of Sergei Magnitsky in prison in Moscow. And Boris and I were sitting in the visitors' gallery of the US House of Representatives, not too far from here, watching them vote on this. And Boris said, this is the most pro-Russian piece of legislation ever passed in any foreign country, because it targets those who abuse our rights and who steal our money through corruption. And he also said to me that day, he said, when we have democracy and the rule of law in our country again, I will be the first one, he said, to come back here to Washington and argue for a repeal of the Magnitsky Act, because we will no longer need this, because we will have our own real justice system that will be able to take care of the scoundrels and the torturers and the thieves and the human rights abusers. That's not going to be today or tomorrow, but it will come. That day will come. And those of us who are alive then, I think, will be coming to Western capitals and arguing in favor of the abolition of that law.
When that day comes, we will look back, and one of the signal events was the Magnitsky Act.
I agree completely.
You know, why don't you just talk for a moment about what happened last weekend? You had, Dmitry Gudkov in the film and his United Democrats, what they accomplished. And then, if you would just repeat for the benefit of this audience here what you said yesterday, if you could tell that story about Rudolf Kara. I just think it's so profound, this metaphor that you created, I just found it to be profoundly significant.
You're really impressed by this guy.
I was, and I looked him up afterwards.
Well, what happened last weekend was that there were municipal elections that took place all across Russia, and Moscow was one of those places. And so, for the first time in many, many years, the Russian opposition actually managed to do something it's not usually known for, and that is to unite and to find common ground. And the United Democrats, which was this wide pro-democracy coalition, which included people from Yabloko, people from Open Russia, which is our own movement, people from Solidarity, the movement that was founded by Boris Nemtsov, and many, many non-partisan independent civil society activists. This coalition nominated about 1,000 candidates in the city of Moscow, and nearly 270 of them won seats in the municipal councils. In fact, 17 district municipal councils in the city of Moscow now have opposition majorities. And that includes, very symbolically, the Gagarinsky district, where Mr. Putin himself voted on Sunday. That also includes Krasnoselsky district in the northwestern part of the center of Moscow. And Ilya Yashin, whom you saw in that film, who's our fellow pro-democracy activist, he's now preparing to become the chairman of the district municipal council in that part of Moscow. So this was really, on a practical level, it's not going to mean too much, because unfortunately in the authoritarian regime that we have today, local self-government does not have much power, it does not have many prerogatives, but it's a psychological breakthrough. Because now, even officially, according to the official count by the regime, the pro-democracy opposition is now the second most powerful force in the city of Moscow, ahead of the communists, ahead of the nationalists from Zhirinovsky's party, ahead of a Just Russia. This is by their own count. And I think it's also an important reminder that, there's this conventional wisdom, I guess, or stereotype that Vladimir Putin is so widely popular and the opposition, is nowhere near. Well, you know what? If you're not on the ballot, it's difficult for you to get too many votes. And in most Russian elections in the last 18 years, the opposition doesn't actually make it on the ballot. In the rare cases where it does, we show very significant results. 4 years ago, Alexei Navalny received nearly 30% in the mayoral election in Moscow. They allowed him on the ballot because they thought he will get 1 or 2%, and then they'll be able to say to the whole world, well, there's your opposition, 1.5. He got 30. Boris Nemtsov, in that same year, in 2013, he actually won an election. He became the first non-systemic politician in Russia to actually win an election. This is a contradiction in terms. This is not supposed to happen. We have these two phrases for the opposition in Russia. One is systemic, which is the docile, controlled, fake opposition that the Kremlin allows and that's present in legislative bodies. And the other is non-systemic, which is genuine, authentic, uncompromising opposition. Well, Boris Nemtsov managed to stay genuine, authentic, and uncompromising and win an election. He was the first and still so far the only one to do so on the regional parliamentary level. And of course, again, this past Sunday, we saw this again in municipal elections all across, not just in Moscow, but this is important too. For example, in the Pskov region, which is in the northwest of Russia, our good friend and colleague Lev Schlossberg was, by the way, the first Russian politician to provide definitive proof of the presence of regular Russian troops in Ukraine, which of course the Kremlin was denying and lying about this and saying these are all people on vacation or volunteers. He actually got information. He has this local newspaper that he owns in the Pskov region, and this newspaper received and published information about members of the Pskov paratrooper division who were sent to Ukraine, who were killed there in the Donbass in the summer of 2014. Then they were brought back and buried like dogs in unmarked graves with numbers instead of names, because the Russian army didn't want to admit that it had regular soldiers in Ukraine. He found this out, he published it, he was beaten up very severely. He was in a coma too in hospital, I think. He was actually kicked out of the regional parliament, of which he was a member. But then last year, the people of Pskov elected him back to the regional parliament, and he's a member of it now. And last Sunday, the Yabloko party, which he's the leader of in the Pskov region, won seats in 3/4 of the district municipal councils across the Pskov region. So if anybody tells you that Putin's so wildly popular and the opposition is nowhere, this is a lie, and it's important to stress it. And I know Carl was really impressed by this story, so I have to say it again. But we were talking yesterday, we had this panel in the morning chaired by Carl on Capitol Hill, and I was discussing a little bit about what Open Russia, the movement which I'm honored to represent, is doing. And the main focus of our work is education of the young people, political education of young people. We work with this new young generation of pro-democracy activists all across the country, and we want to help them become active and informed citizens. And we want to help them gain the skills and the experience that they will need the day Putin has gone from power, one way or the other. And one of the ways we do this is by actually putting them through the selection process, although of course we know everything there is to know about elections in Putin's Russia, that they're not real, that they're not free, that they're not fair. But we still use this process to help them gain the experience and the skills, because if they're candidates, even in these conditions, they can still learn how to walk door to door, how to speak to people, how to speak at rallies, how to publish leaflets in newspapers and organize on local issues, and they're wiser because of it. And the analogy I use to for the work that we do is indeed with I guess he's your favorite musician now, Carl, but there was this very celebrated Soviet pianist Rudolf Kara in the mid-20th century, and he was an ethnic German. So when the Second World War began in 1941, or for us it did anyway, he was exiled to Kazakhstan, along with many other ethnic Germans. And he spent 13 years, from 1941 to 1954, living somewhere in the wooden barracks in the steppes of Kazakhstan, and needless to say, he did not have a piano with him. So he took out a plank of wood and a knife, and he carved a pretend keyboard on this plank of wood, and he would practice on it every morning and every evening so that his fingers wouldn't forget how to play. And then, under Khrushchev in the 50s, he was allowed to return back to Moscow. He became a soloist at the Moscow Philharmonic. He taught at the Moscow Conservatoire. In the 1960s, he won the USSR-wide musical soloist competition. He was one of the most accomplished pianists of his era. And for 13 years, the guy practiced on a plank of wood. So what we are doing now, all across Russia, and we have more than 20 regional chapters at Open Russia today, we are trying to give them this plank of wood so that they can practice using what means and opportunities we have now, and so that they're ready, or at least as ready as can be, when that time comes. Because one of the things we know about the modern history of Russia is that big political change always happens quickly and unexpectedly, like this. If somebody said at the beginning of August 1991 that by the end of the month there will not be a Soviet regime, I think a lot of people would have thought that person is crazy who's saying it, but that is what happened. And a regime that existed for 74 years went down in 3 days. You just saw that in the film. But the problem, of course, with that is that so many people, including many people around Yeltsin in that government, were unprepared for this. Because when it happens, it's too late to sit down and start thinking, okay, what do we do now? So we need to do this now. We need to prepare for that future change now, and this is what we're trying to do, including by preparing the actual generation that will be doing this change. Because, I mean, the demographics don't lie. The prevailing age of the protesters that we saw on the streets of Russia in June was between 17 and 25. Putin's 65. That's not a good demographic correlation for them. And so we're trying to get them as ready as we can get them for that moment of change, because nothing's forever. And Mr. Putin certainly behaves in a way, or at least it seems so often, as if he thinks he's actually going to be there forever. But he's not. One way or the other, there will come a day when he's no longer in power. And we need to be preparing for that time today. And this is what we're trying to do.
Thank you. Senator, if we have 5 more minutes.
Yeah, could I just
Yeah.
mention, from an American standpoint, why do we care so much about what happens in Russia? The Russians tried to change the outcome of our last election. In other words, undermine the very fundamental of a democracy, and that is a free and fair election. The Russians are now establishing themselves in the Middle East in a way that they haven't been since Anwar Sadat threw them out of Egypt in 1972. The Russians are now, today as we speak, conducting the largest military exercise they have in history in Belarus. And what was once a very adversarial relationship between Belarus and Russia has now become one of accommodation. Obviously, the Russians are hand in glove with Bashar Assad in Syria. Obviously, the Russians are aligning themselves with Hezbollah and Hamas and other terrorist organizations. Obviously, the Russians are putting pressure on the Baltics. Obviously, the Russians are trying to extend and restore what was once the Russian Empire. And the pressures that they've been putting on countries in the Baltics and the Balkans is really enormous. And part of that pressure, unfortunately, has resulted in more dictatorial behavior in countries like Hungary and Poland, in imitating that success that Vladimir Putin has demonstrated. So there's a lot of reasons why we should care a great deal about what's happening in Russia, besides all of our advocacies for human rights, all of us are created equal, etc. One of the most famous phrases ever uttered was by Margaret Thatcher, and she said, Ronald Reagan won the Cold War without firing a shot. And what we're seeing, particularly in Eastern Europe, is a tendency towards totalitarianism, towards suppression of religion, suppression of the press, where they may not be Russians, but they certainly watch Vladimir Putin get away with it and see that that's a way to go to become more powerful. And the result, of course, is a reduction of the principles of democracy. And why we're sitting here today is because Ronald Reagan had a great idea, and it was to have organizations whose sole mission in life was to further the cause of democracy and human rights. And that's why, Carl, I'm always honored to be in your company.
We're honored to be with you, Senator. We're honored to be with you.
Very quickly. I just want to mention one thing quickly. I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago with one policymaker here in this town in Washington, and he said to me, well, you must understand, not a lot of people, or at least not everyone, cares whether or not there's democracy in Russia. All we care about is that Russia doesn't invade or attack other countries. And I said to him, well, you know what? Those two things are inextricably and directly linked. And they have been for a long time. And those people, and there were many, I must say, among the Western political elites, who, when Vladimir Putin came to power all those years ago, they said, okay, let him do whatever he does in Russia. Let him rig the elections and censor the media and put his opponents in prison. We don't really care, as long as we can find a modus vivendi with him on the international arena. But you know what? It doesn't work this way. And there's no reason to expect a government that disrespects the rights of its own people and that breaks its own laws to then respect international norms or the interests of other countries. Why should it? And so those in the West who prefer to close their eyes on what Putin was doing, on the election rigging and the media censorship and the political repressions in Russia, one day woke up to the first territorial annexation in Europe since the Second World War, which Mr. Putin achieved in Crimea. And those two things are directly linked. And I must say, a few weeks ago, I was watching, I'm a historian by education, so you must forgive me that I do this. I'm kind of ashamed to admit it, but sometimes I'm watching old political debates on, the recordings on YouTube, and it's all easy to find. And I saw a debate. It was a South Carolina Republican presidential debate between Senator McCain and George W. Bush in February of 2000. And the presenter asked, "So what do you think about Vladimir Putin?" And Senator McCain answered, "I think he may be one of those who will want to make the trains run on time." This is, of course, a reference to Mussolini. And in so many ways, the way the Putin regime consolidated its power and established a dictatorship was actually similar to how Mussolini did this in the early 1920s in Italy. This was February of 2000. This was before Vladimir Putin even became president officially. But unfortunately, there are very few Senator McCains. There were then, there are now, and I think there always will be, and this is why we're so grateful that you are here generally and that you're here with us tonight. And we hope to be seeing a lot more of you in many, many coming years, and I hope I'm speaking for everyone in this room.
If we have 5 more minutes of your time, can we just, since the audience has stayed, if we could just take maybe 2 questions, and I see one hand over here.
Business about media group from Latvia. So Vladimir Vladimirovich. Oh, one more time. Oleg Merkulov, Business Baltia Media Group from Latvia. So Vladimir Vladimirovich, first question is, thank you for a brilliant movie. And the question is, what was Boris Nemtsov's position on the issue of discrimination of Russian-speaking population in Latvia after the breakup of the Soviet Union in regards with citizenship and language? And by the way, what is the position, current position of your party on the same issue? Has it changed a lot? And Senator McCain, if I may use this opportunity to ask the question, you've been to Riga many times, and you probably noticed that a lot of people in everyday life, they use Russian language, about 65% in Riga and 40% in Latvia itself, but Russian language doesn't have any status, so it's equalized with Japanese and Amharic, and about a few hundred, 200,000-300,000 people do not have citizenship. Even kids who born in Latvia do not have it. And I would like to hear your comments about that too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Should I go first?
Yeah, why don't you go?
Oleg, first of all, good to see you. We usually see each other in church, but it's good to see you here. I actually just came back from a conference in Tallinn in Estonia 2 days ago. There was a week-long series of events because Estonia holds the European Union presidency, so there were several parliamentary meetings. And I must say that the first time I went to the Baltic states was about 10 years ago, a little more. And I don't consider myself as someone who is particularly brainwashed by Putin's propaganda. I hope that I'm more informed than this. But I must say that even I, when I went to it was Riga and Tallinn back then, even I was a little hesitant to speak Russian when I was in Riga and in Tallinn, because I was thinking there'll be some consequences for me, or I'll be punished, or there'll be something bad will happen. This is such baloney. This is what they tell you in Putin's TV. If you watch Channel 1 and Rossiya 1, they'll tell you that if you speak Russian on the streets of Riga and Tallinn, you'll be shot or something. Well, I go pretty often to the Baltic states. I always speak Russian and never have any problems. And of course, the situation is different even officially in the Baltic states because, for example, Lithuania, thanks to its first post-independence president, Vytautas Landsbergis, and thanks to Member of Parliament Emanuelis Zingeris, who's with us here this evening, wrote a law that granted, first of all, automatic citizenship to everybody, which they did back in 1991, is that correct, in the autumn? And needless to say, in Lithuania too, although the proportion of Russians in Lithuania is smallest of all the Baltic states, I have certainly no trouble and no problem speaking Russian when I'm in Vilnius, the same way I'm in Tallinn or Riga. So, and I know Boris Nemtsov always liked very much to go to the Baltic states. He was in Vilnius, he was in Riga, he was in Tallinn many times. He never missed the Leonard Meri conference, which takes place every spring in Tallinn and brings together a lot of policymakers from around the world. He always loved going there. And in fact, in March of 2015, we were supposed to go together with him to Vilnius for the 25th anniversary of the restoration of Lithuanian independence. There was a meeting at the Lithuanian parliament, which Emanuelis Zingeris hosted, and we were supposed to fly with him. I think it was on the 10th or 11th of March, and of course he was killed on the 27th of February, and I believe he had a video message from him when he was already no longer there. So again, every time I go to the Baltic States, I certainly speak Russian, and I never have any problems with it.
I didn't quite get the question.
The status of Russian language in the Baltic States.
The Russian language, as you know, varies with each of the three little countries, and it's probably more prevalent in Lithuania than any place else. But there's a history there, and I worry about the Russian pressures on the three Baltic states. But there's a strong feeling of nationalism in all three of those countries. I can remember as a small boy seeing the 4th of July parade, the captive nations flag. And their allegiance to their country, I believe, even if as many as 30% or more speak Russian, they have no allegiance to Russia. And the pressures that the Russians and Vladimir Putin are putting on these three beautiful little countries, I think in the long run alienates the Russian speakers from Russia and Russian influence than attracts. And again, I think that because they were able to start from scratch, they are doing very well. And when the country economically is doing well, they're certainly not interested in being under the influence of the Russian system. Frankly, I worry more about what's happening in a country like Hungary today, where they're seeing a consolidation of power into the hands of one individual and repression of rights. And I, of course, worry about the traditional place where so many wars have started, and that's the Balkans. I went through the Balkans, and I think that some of them are doing well, others not so well. And you see penetration not only of Russia, but also of some rather radical Islamic elements as well.
I just want to add very quickly that on the same point, for many years when I was meeting with political leaders from the Baltic states, I would always say to them that I think it's very important that you develop the media in your countries, the news media, in the Russian language. Because if you don't do this, you're just ceding the ground to Putin's propaganda. Because then all people will have to watch is Channel 1 or Russia 1. And if you're not doing it, then he will. And I'm very happy to see that in recent years, literally in the last 2 or 3 years, certainly Latvia and Estonia have moved to actually open national public broadcasting in the Russian language. And when I was in Tallinn a few days ago, I was actually live on a television show on an Estonian national public broadcaster in Russian. And we had, because I had the screening of the same film in Tallinn, and then there was a program about it. And in the same way in Latvia recently, I think it's called LV1 or LV2, one of the national TV channels, which is in Russian too, and we had a whole broadcast there. And I think it's very important, and I cannot emphasize the importance of this enough. This goes for actually not just the Baltic states, but particularly the Baltic states. If you don't do, because all normal people want to watch news in their own language. That's normal. So if you don't do it in Russian, Putin will. And you have to give people the choice. And I'm very happy to see that all the Baltic states are moving to this direction. In fact, in Lithuania, when we were just in May for the Lithuanian Foreign Ministry Russia Forum, we were also took part in a show, live show on Lithuanian national TV, the same television center that was attacked by Soviet tanks in January of 1991. And again, there was a whole hour-long program in the Russian language. And I think this is very important to do. Russian language was not invented by Putin, just as it was not invented by Stalin.
And
It's a beautiful language with a long history and culture, and I'm happy to see many more media outlets in the Baltic states use it.
We're over-answering, but one of the great factors in winning Cold War was Radio Free Europe. And that has fallen down with disarray for a whole lot of reasons. But just in the last couple of years, we've started to realize the importance of it and really do a much better job of sending that message through the Radio Free Europe.
And the fact that they're speaking Russian freely has an influence in Russia, I'm sure. Okay, one last question right here.
Thank you. Eleanor Bachrach. I wonder sort of what is the influence of Boris Nemtsov today as a martyr to democratic ideals. Sometimes these assassinations really have the opposite impact, and I'm hope that in fact his assassination has caused more people to be dedicated to his ideals.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. And I can tell you certainly that his memory very much lives on, his popular memory in Russia. And every year on the 27th of February, which is the anniversary of his assassination, tens of thousands of people march through the streets of Moscow in his honor and in his memory. And every day, more than 2.5 years on now, every day people still bring flowers and light candles at the spot where he was killed, on Bolshoi Moskovetsky Bridge. And almost every night, the Moscow authorities send the police to steal those flowers and those candles and the portraits and to ransack it and to take it away, because they're fighting his memory almost as much as they were fighting him. And this is seen in so many different instances. There were many public petitions and initiatives, and tens of thousands of signatures were collected to have any kind of commemoration for a Russian statesman in Russia. You would think there shouldn't be a problem with this. We have an Hugo Chavez street in Moscow. That's okay for them. We have a street named after Kadyrov Sr., the father of the current Chechen dictator Kadyrov, who once declared a jihad against Russia. And we have a street to him in Moscow. That's okay too. Oh, but not Boris Nemtsov. Not the former deputy prime minister of the Russian Federation. No, never. They rejected every single initiative and petition in this regard. And in fact, last week, the residents, the people who live in the apartment block where Boris lived in Moscow, they took the initiative in their own hands. They collected the necessary signatures. They themselves paid for and produced and put up a small sign which says that Boris Nemtsov lived here. And the same day, the Moscow mayor's office announced that the sign will be dismantled, and in fact it was dismantled 2 days ago. So they're fighting his memory as much as they were fighting him. And so when we meet with our counterparts from democratic countries, we ask them to do what we cannot for now do in our own country. We are not permitted, it seems, to honor a Russian statesman in Russia. So let's try to do it in the countries where it is possible. And there are several cities around the world which have initiatives to commemorate Boris Nemtsov on their own maps, in their own streets. And there is a congressional bill right here in the United States, a bill of which Senator John McCain is one of the lead co-sponsors, and we're very grateful for that. It's Bill S-459, which already passed committee stage in the Senate, which proposes to designate a small area on Wisconsin Avenue Northwest in front of the Russian embassy in Washington as Boris Nemtsov Plaza. And we hope and expect that this bill will pass, because it will be a very important reminder, first to us, to Russian Democrats, that you have not forgotten about us and that you actually care and remember and know. But also I think it'll be a very important reminder to Americans that Russia doesn't just have to be associated with autocracy and belligerence and aggression, that there's another side of Russia that Boris Nemtsov symbolized. And I know there will come a day, I can only imagine what the current Russian foreign ministry will think of this idea, but I know there will come a day when the Russian embassy will be proud to have Boris Nemtsov's name in its address.
As the old embassy had to have Sakharov Street right in front of
Well, of course, that was a precedent. So 1984, when Andrei Sakharov was in internal exile in Gorky, a Republican senator from New York, Alphonse D'Amato, introduced a bill, attached it to the DC Appropriations Bill, which renamed, again, a small stretch of 16th Street Northwest, where the Soviet embassy was located, as Andrei Sakharov Plaza. And again, you can imagine what the Soviet government thought of that at the time. But 7 years after that, this goes again to what we're talking about, how quickly things change in Russia. In 1984, Congress renamed the street, or this plaza. In 1991, the Russian embassy installed a bust of Andrei Sakharov proudly in the embassy itself. And last time I was there, which is 5 years ago now, because I'm non grata, I'm not allowed to enter the Russian embassy here. I must be the only Russian citizen who is banned from it. But the last time I was there in 2012, astonishingly, it was still there. So only 7 years passed from the moment of the renaming to a bust of Sakharov being installed by the Russian ambassador in the Russian embassy. So I really mean this when I say that I have no doubt that the Russian state will be proud to have such an address, and will be grateful to people like Senator McCain, who led on this effort today when it's a difficult time for us.